part of that innovation has been to develop a test for COVID-19 using saliva. This is work done by Professor Deb Williamson and was published actually a few weeks ago. The test was first validated on 600 specimens collected at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and actually performed well, but not as well as the throat swab. It has a sensitivity of around 87%. The advantage of the saliva test, of course, is that it's much more acceptable for people to give a specimen. People just need to collect saliva in their mouth for a minute or two and then spit it into a small jar, and then that small jar gets sent off to the laboratory and the standard test is again performed to detect COVID-19. We think it will play a role in bolstering testing reach across the state, particularly, as you heard earlier, in vulnerable populations or in people who have trouble with the throat swab, such as children or other individuals who find it more acceptable. The gold standard, of course, is a throat swab, but we do believe that this certainly plays a role. Much better to have this done than to have no test at all. We'll be working with the department in comparing it to throat swabs as well as testing it in these other populations. And happy to take any questions about that. Thanks.
How have you been able to verify that its authenticity, that you get as authentic a result with your test versus the current test?
So first of all, the saliva test has been evaluated in multiple other laboratories in other countries, and 5 large studies using saliva have been published, including our study for Melbourne. And to validate it, what we did was collect 600 specimens from the Royal Melbourne COVID-19 testing site. Each specimen had the conventional, each person had a conventional throat swab done, and at the same time gave a sample of saliva. Amongst those 600 participants in that period of testing, there were 39 positive tests, and the saliva test picked 87% of those 39 tests. And that's how we develop a evaluation of any new test. We look at sensitivity. How many times does the test get it right? 87% of the time. And we also look at specificity. Is there any risk of it getting it wrong? And there was no issues with specificity.
Brett, is it now time to lock down Victoria again, given these numbers are rapidly rising?
Can I just ask if we've got any further questions for Professor Lewin first, perhaps?
So when you say 87%, is there any possibility that false negatives are going to come up?
Well, 87% means that it will miss diagnoses 13% of the time. And the reason why that happens, and again this was shown in that initial validation, is that you have lower levels of virus in saliva compared to the nose. So definitely the levels are lower, and that means you have a risk of missing some tests. So it's not as good, but it's certainly better than no test at all.
So is that they're not 13% of the time when someone could have the virus but told they don't and they're out spreading it?
That's exactly right, meaning that it's not as sensitive as the throat swab, but it is a good alternative if someone's not going to have a throat swab at all. And also the recommendation, of course, is, even with a throat swab, that if you have a negative test and have ongoing symptoms, you need to come back and have another test.
How many of these tests have you been able to produce that, going forward, how many will you be able to
Well, the technology to find the virus is exactly the same as the technology to find the virus in a throat swab. So our capability to do thousands and thousands of throat swab tests will be the same technology for the saliva test. The difference is in the collection. Rather than using a swab and sort of someone sticking something down your nose, you actually collect saliva, it goes to the laboratory, and then the processing is pretty much the same as what you'd have for a throat swab.
I think you touched on it before, but I just spit in a jar. Do I have to do anything before I spit in the jar?
Collect a bit of...
Do I just spit whatever's in my mouth, or can you clarify?
Yes, you let saliva pool in your mouth for a minute or two to get enough of a specimen, and then spit into a jar. And on the initial validation that was published the initial development of the test that was published a few weeks ago, it was a 3-hour time gap between collection and getting to the lab, and the virus was still there. And this was actually developed, all the development that led to that looked at exactly that sort of question: how long does the virus survive in there? How long can you keep it? At what temperature? How do you extract it?
So once I've spat it in the jar, how long can it go before it must be tested? 3 hours?
Yeah, that was the average duration of time where we found that it performed well.
What percentage accuracy is the throat swab? This is 87%. What's the throat swab? Is it 100% or is it?
No, we know the throat swabs, this is compared to the throat swab, which is our current, what we call gold standard. We know that the throat swab is not perfect either, of course. Throat swabs can miss people because if the quality of the collection is poor, if you don't actually get the swab right down to the back of the throat or the nose. So we know that the sensitivity of throat swabs is also not 100%, which is why the recommendations to people and their practitioners are that if there's ongoing symptoms and the person is still unwell, the throat swab should be repeated.
So, practically, what new equipment do you need for the tests? Like, is it essentially laboratories just changing the way they analyse?
Practically, no new equipment in the laboratory, exactly the same pipeline for the PCR test itself. The only new equipment is a little container like you'd have a urine test, a little yellow-topped container for the collection.
How many jars have you got? How many do you need? How many tests do you think you'll be doing a day?
We'd have infinite numbers of jars, I would have thought. They're definitely not in short supply, used routinely across the hospital. So the limitation for all testing, of course, is the kind of ingredients for the PCR test, but with all the planning that's been done in Victoria, we don't see that as a limiting factor at the moment.
Hundreds a day, you think you'll do? Thousands a day?
At the moment, we're looking in the range of hundreds because we're looking at comparing it, seeing how this test goes in populations such as kids or disabled people. The validation was done in a COVID-19 testing clinic at Royal Melbourne, so it was largely in adults, in people that were symptomatic and turning up for testing back in April.
Have you had interest on this test from not just in Victoria and Australia?
Other countries are also looking at this. There's a pilot study being done in the UK as well. I mean, the attractive thing, of course, potentially could be that you can do this test at home and then send it in. That would be the perfect, outcome, that eventually you could use it as a home-based test. But we still got a bit of work to develop it for that.